Welcome to the House of Stewards. One of the most influential, one of the most powerful, and one of the most controversial households of England, the House of Stewards. Now, the House of Stewards can be traced back from the Anglo-Saxon period. We can understand that they start their houses from the House of Wessex. They have relatives in the House of Plantagenets. Their cousins were Tudors. And here we have the Stuarts. The present generation of the British kings, the Hanoverians or the German or the House of Windsor also are distant relatives of the House of Stewards. Now the period of House of Stewards happens between 1603. It begins in 1603 and ends in 1716. Now taking the major monarchs of House of Stewards, you have King James the First. James the First was the ruler of Scotland. He was James the Sixth, and as the Queen of England, Elizabeth the First, died without any children, James the Sixth, her distant cousin, was called to take the throne as the King of England. Now he was titled as James the First, and James had three children. The first was Henry, the Prince of Wales. Henry died as a teenager, and so the second son, Charles, ascended the throne on his place as Charles the First. However, Charles was not a popular king, and Charles was never a favorite of the people. So people rose in rebellion, and there was a civil war, and by the end of the civil war, Charles was deposed. And a Puritan leader whose name was Oliver Cromwell became the ruler of England. Now, his rule was also not favored by people because he was strict, moralistic and religious in nature. So, Charles was never a success, and Charles's predecessor, Cromwell, was also never a success, and Charles' son was called back from exile and he was instated as Charles II. Charles II was also called the Merry Monarch because he had so many relations with women and he had fathered around 12 illicit children. However, he did not have an original heir, so Charles's monarchy passed on to his younger brother James II. Just like his predecessors, James was also not a favorite of the people. So the end result was that James was not at all liked by the people. His sister Mary was called to the throne by the people. But Mary was married to William, the Prince of Orange. He was from Netherlands. William made a condition that if Mary has to take the throne, he should also be called in. So William and Mary became the first ever combined monarchs of England. Now, as Mary and William had never had a child, after so many enquiries, the throne moved to Mary's sister Anne. Now, Queen Anne was the most successful ruler of the Stuart dynasty. Queen Anne had several miscarriages, so she did not have any children, and in the end, the dynasty came to an end with Queen Anne. Now, James was the most influential person of the period, but however, James cannot be considered as equivalent to Queen Elizabeth. But when you consider the acts of James, you can very well see that James's acts were somewhat appeasing to the people. As we go down the ladder, we can see that the people started revolting against the people about the other monarchs, and it is only when Mary and William and Anne are there where you find that they have any importance or any great value for the Stuart kings. By the time Anne died, there was no rulers. So James, Charles's sister, her name was Elizabeth. She was married to a German prince, and he was the elector of Palatine, and her daughter Sophia, and Sophia's children George got the monarchy, and they formed the Hanoverian dynasty. Now, taking into account the major incidents that happened during the period of James the First. One of the most important thing you can give credit to James is the KJV, or the King James Bible, or the King James Version, which was a 5-year-old project that accounted for the recreation or the original translation of the Bible. Second, you have the Puritan versus Catholic controversy. James was actually a Catholic, while England was basically Protestant in nature. So everybody had a doubt that whether James supported Catholics or whether James supported Puritans. So as a result, there was always a question of problem. So the Puritans during James's period moved out of England, and they established the colony their colonies in the Americas, or the present USA. They left on a single ship called Mayflower, and they moved to the Americas and established 16 colonies. They were initially called as the Pilgrim Fathers. Now, as there was a question of confusion between them, we have another controversy happening here. It was called the Gunpowder Plot. Now, people feared that this man would be a threat to them. So, a set of Catholics under a person called Guy Fawkes formed a party, and they wanted to destroy the parliament, and they got up all sorts of gunpowder, barrels and barrels of gunpowder, and they planted it under the parliament. So the Gunpowder Plot was the next thing that was associated with James the First. Now, James had a major concern about his power, so he used the divine rights theory. This is a theory which was used by the European monarchs to prove that their lineage actually came from God itself. So they believed that they were the descendants of Jesus. So to rule is their power, to rule is their authority. So they supported a movement that is called the divine rights theory. Now, James was a failure in only one thing, that was in his deals with the parliament. Now, as you know, the people of England was more conscious about their civil rights, and they never cared for any monarch who disbanded their civil rights. So, Parliament or the speaking house was a very important place for them. So, when James ascended the throne, he called the Parliament and he used the Parliament, but at the same time, he was never a success with the Parliament. He actually enjoyed the wealth that Elizabeth had amassed, but he wanted to have more power, more wealth, more taxes, so that he can gain the respect of the other countries. So he always had a tug of war between the parliament. In his initial days, the question with the parliament was not a problem, because he used the same advisor, Sir Robert Cecil of Queen Elizabeth. So it was not a problem for him. But when Lord Cecil died, he changed his advisors, and he used Villiers, his trusted friend, as Duke of Buckingham, as his associate. So the end result was that there was always a tug of war between James and the Parliament. But there was never a problem between the both, and they coexisted without much problem. But the problem continued, and as his son Charles ascended the throne, the issue with the Parliament was so viral. Now, the second major monarch of the time, Charles the First. The major problems that happened here was the Spanish War, or some critics or some theoreticians call it as the Continental War. It was called the Continental War because England wanted to be a supreme power, and in its urge to be a supreme power in the days of colonialism, it started warring amongst other colonial powers. Now, the second, as I have earlier said, the tug of war between the parliament and the king. So, always the parliament objected whatever the king said. Now, as I said, he continued to believe in his father's advisor, the Duke of Buckingham. They never believed, they never gave importance to what Charles said. Now, Charles had a special advisor, the Archbishop Laud. Archbishop was a Protestant, so he punished the Catholics. And he had another friend called Sir Thomas Wentworth, who was appointed as the governor of Ireland. Wentworth was a very ruthless person who appointed his own army to suppress the Catholic belief of Ireland. Now, the end result of all his doings was the Civil War. And as part of the Civil War, we have, towards the end of the Civil War in 1649, you have Charles being beheaded by the people. The only monarch who was ousted by his own people in England was Charles I. Now, the Civil War was led by people, particularly a particular person called Oliver Cromwell. Now, Oliver Cromwell took charge as the next ruler, but he never used the title of a monarch. Though he worked as a monarch, he called himself as the Lord Protector. And England became protectorate. Also, Commonwealth. In those days, it was not a socialist ideology, it was more than a religious ideology. As Cromwell, the ruler, as he became the authority, the first thing he did was to close the theatres. You know, theatres or entertainment was a very major factor that people wish. So, once the theatres were closed, and as Puritans were sticklers for religious customs, people started hating them. Now, Cromwell, the father Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell, was the ruler of England for a long time, and for 10 years. And when he died, the heirship passed to his son, Robert. But Robert was a weak ruler, and the people called back Charles II, or the son of Charles I. Now, the most important thing you can see is that the parliament is functioning in an elected manner. If the parliament was appointed here, it was elected, and the people's representatives had a role in the speaking of the day-to-day running of the activities of the place. Now, as Charles II was called from exile, Charles received unprecedented support from the people. Maybe because of the oppressive character of the Puritans, that he received excess power from the persons. Now, he was called the Merry One of the reasons might be he was having so many relations with women, flirtatious relations with women, and he was a father. He fathered around 12 illicit children, but none of them actually had ascended the throne. Now, he was also known for the beginning of one of the most important societies of England. It is called the Royal Society. He was the one who gave charter to the Royal Society. Also, he is known to have started the institution of Poet Laureate or the court poet of England. Now, taking the good sides away, he has got too many bad sides also. The most controversial things was the plague of England, plague of London to be specific. As London became the capital or the commercial capital, what happened was that so many goods were brought from outside, and as so many goods was brought from outside, there were rats infesting the place, and plague, which was the last greater incident of plague was in 16th century, and the 17th 18th century also witnessed plague of London. Then again we have the most serious incident called the Great Fire of London. What started as a household fire continued for 3 days, and it ended the city of London. About 3/4 of the London city was consumed by this fire. However, people didn't actually care to depose Charles, but they kept on with him and they moved on. Now we have, when he passed away, we have James II as his brother becoming the ruler. James ruled for a very short period, and James was known for his Catholicism, and he was against the Protestant setup. So, as he was against the Protestant setup, normally he became an enemy of the people on the very first setup. Now, he also quarreled with the parliament, so the parliament was not favoring him. So, after 3 years, he had to go to exile as his sister Mary was called from Netherlands to occupy the throne. So, we have the next set of monarchs, Mary and William. In the normal custom, there will be only Mary II. But William, the Prince of Orange, Netherlands, said that if you want to be Mary as your queen, you have to accept me as your king. So, we have the first ever twin monarchs or the combined monarchs, Mary and William, as the rulers. The parliament gained much during their reign as the act of representation. That is, no representative can be reprimanded by the king. The king was ruled by the parliament, or the system was given much importance than many others. Now, as I have earlier said, Mary and William had no children, so the reign moved to Anne, their younger sister, Mary's younger sister, and Anne's period was relatively more peaceful than many other times. And Anne, to a great extent, was a compassionate leader, or to a great extent we can say that she was a shadow of Queen Elizabeth. Now, we may call that she was the most important ruler who actually ruled the United Kingdom, or England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. For a brief period, she was the ruler of France also. Now, the two things that have further importance in her time was the Act of Union. Or the act which made United Kingdom possible, that is, England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland became joined together as one single kingdom. And the second most important thing is the Act of succession. It was the decision of who should succeed the king. So act of succession gave right to two things, that a direct male descendant or a female descendant who is Protestant in nature should be the ruler, and no other person, outsiders, no other relatives of Catholic heir, Catholic lineage will never be tolerated in England. So that was the most important thing that happened during Anne's time. And Victoria and Anne are two persons. There is no second rulers who are having the same name. So these are the major incidents that happened during the period. So with Anne, we find the period ending. As Anne died, it was the end of the Stuart dynasty also, and the dynasty changed to the Hanoverian dynasty from her distant cousin George the First of England, the present rulers of England. Hope you have understood the whole history of the Stuarts. Thank you for your patience.